We are still keeping an eye on the coronavirus, and by the looks of it, that won't change anytime soon. The World Health Organization touched down in China to lend a helping hand in the effort to contain the virus. President Trump unveiled his budget proposal yesterday, totaling $4.8 trillion with a T. Unsurprisingly, it would make severe cuts to Medicaid, food stamps, and getting rid of the government student loan forgiveness program. The proposal would keep Medicare intact and give NASA $25 billion. Apart from leaving a lot of Americans hanging, Trump's budget would also fail to eliminate the national deficit over the next decade. On today's Whisk, and perhaps across most of the rest of the country, people are keeping their eyes on New Hampshire. The state's primary is today, and voters have already started showing up at the polls. Democratic presidential hopefuls have been hitting the pavement and hosting rallies, and even President Trump joined the mix with his own event. But tonight isn't just about Trump. We'll be chatting with a pollster about what could unfold once results wrap up later tonight. I'm Jamal Simmons. Here's why you should care. Voters in New Hampshire already started casting their ballots in the state primary. While Senator Sanders is expected to come away with a big win, fellow Senator Amy Klobuchar is hoping her recent uptick in the polls is going to make a splash. Joining me to chat about New Hampshire and 2020 politics in general is pollster Molly Murphy. Molly, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for letting me here.
All right, so we just want to let people know before we get started, your firm is doing some work for the Biden campaign. However, you are not doing any of it.
Correct.
All right,
yes.
So good. So we are going to get an unvarnished view. So tell us, Bernie is rising in New Hampshire. This is the state he won against Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. It looks like he's coming back for another victory. According to the polls, do you think his campaign has done better this year than people expected because he was down for a while? And what's behind that?
Well, I do think that people were perhaps surprised. Maybe 2 months ago, people might have been surprised to see how well Senator Sanders did in Iowa. He was, sort of always a front runner, but I think because there would be other candidates that sort of popped up and took on that top slot, he was never really taking that top position. People didn't necessarily expect that he was going to be as competitive, come in a very close second in Iowa. But I do think people always expected Senator Sanders to do very well in New Hampshire, either win it or even 6 months ago, perhaps that he and Elizabeth Warren might split it. But I do think that as far as expectations going into New Hampshire are concerned, people have long expected him to do very well.
So Elizabeth Warren seems to be kind of muddling around in the third, fourth place spot. What happened to her campaign? She was really on the uptick a few months ago, and now it just seems like it's stalled out.
I was thinking about this earlier, and the word I can really just hinge on is inexplicable. I don't know that there is a good explanation or that it is as simple as saying, had she just done this one thing different. My theory, and this is based on data, but it's also just my observation, so take them for what they are. I think that she had this moment where she really ascended and she got the spotlight on her. It's high expectations, little room for error when you are that front runner and people start to try to take you apart. And so the pressure is on. And I think what wound up happening is she wasn't left enough to appeal to the far left. She has these very progressive plans, these very progressive ideologies. But when it came down to getting pushed on, well, how are you going to pay for it or how far is it going to go? She was unwilling to really sort of hunker down and take up that space in the left. But at the same time, she was a little too progressive and viewed as too progressive for some of those moderates and more centrist Democrats. And so ultimately, I think those far left people who were kind of toying with her and some of the more, voters on the right who kind of liked her kind of felt like they weren't sure what they were going to get from her. And so that's my best theory is she was left not really offering either side what they wanted.
And that whiff sometimes of uncertainty, she didn't seem to be sort of sure-footed when she got questions about how she was going to pay for Medicare for all. I also think she had this kind of, I don't know if it was unspoken or spoken, but this pact with Bernie Sanders not to go after each other. It's non-aggression pact. And maybe they hoped they were going to draft behind Sanders and let him be the sort of the leader on this front. But it seems like maybe she ended up being his flak jacket instead. Like, so all the incoming that would have come to Sanders actually landed in her lap, and she's the one that had to deal with all these questions. So it's a tougher place to be.
I think at a certain degree, whether it's the flak jacket, which I agree with, or whether it's just that she was the one who sort of bobbled it, and then he was able to be so decisive. And so he then came in, and I think he seemed more authentic. He seemed more rooted in his principles. And so you could look at two candidates who on paper really support very similar policy solutions, but she didn't seem as sure-footed about hers and maybe wasn't giving people a straight answer. It allowed him the opportunity to basically plant his flag and say, this is where I stand and this is how you're going to pay for it. And I think that that reflected better on him, whether she took the incoming for it or if it just gave him an opportunity to really seize the mantle, one or the other.
So I have another friend who said to me that they think Hillary Clinton sort of showed New Hampshire has a penchant maybe for getting behind a woman candidate. They've had women governors, women senators. So New Hampshire has this penchant behind getting a woman candidate. It seems that that woman candidate is not Elizabeth Warren, it is Amy Klobuchar who is getting that look. What do you think is behind her rise?
That is interesting. I think she had an incredible campaign infrastructure in Iowa. Iowa's success is not just who can advertise the most or who's raising the most money or doing cable news as often, but who is on the ground, who has the organizers who are there knocking doors. It is a process that rewards that type of infrastructure. She did that very well, and Iowa creates momentum. So I think she really exceeded expectations coming out of Iowa, and
even
it allowed.
When we didn't even know the answer,
right?
She
Exactly.
Still seemed like she was doing better.
And so then, she goes into New Hampshire, and just the candidates that did well in Iowa are seeing a bump now. Pete Buttigieg, in the span of a week, has bumped what the Monmouth poll had him up 7 points over the span of a week. So you have these candidates who are sort of barreling into New Hampshire, beating expectations coming out of Iowa. And Elizabeth Warren didn't impress anybody coming out of Iowa. And so it didn't help her, even though New Hampshire's her own backyard.
So we got news today that Joe Biden is bugging out. He's getting out of New Hampshire and he's headed to South Carolina. Does that mean that that Biden campaign is probably going to perform a little less well than people thought? And can he hold on in South Carolina even if he comes in poorly in those first two states?
I think that's the $64,000 or $100 million question, as it were. I think that's certainly what the Biden campaign would say, which is we always knew that Iowa and New Hampshire were not our states. And in fairness, they have been very clear on that for months, that these are not the two places that they are going to do well and come out with a lot of muscle. So I don't think that this is a defeatist posture coming out of Iowa. They have, with Sanders, Warren, with Buttigieg coming in, it was going to at best be probably a three-way fight in New Hampshire. That was always, I think, the theory that people had. So I think he's just acknowledging that, look, these first two states do not spell the nomination for any candidate. There are other states. There are states where he's got more of a constituency, and he's going to go there and campaign there. And so I don't think it's a sign of defeat, but I think the question is, how determinative are New Hampshire and Iowa for the subsequent states?
All right, and there's one more candidate we got to talk about, because even though he's not on the ballot or he's not running hard in these first few states, he is making a big impact in the national polls. We are seeing Mike Bloomberg climb up the national polls to third place, maybe even battling in the second place with the first two people are tied. He's that third candidate that seems to keep showing up. And even with African Americans, we saw that Q poll, but he's now in second place. What is going on with the Bloomberg campaign? Mike
Bloomberg is laying down his advantage, and his advantage is resources. And I think it's a crowded primary. It is a primary where, with the exception of Senator Sanders, who has a very strong and very firmly rooted base, it's still it's a small bit, 25%, let's say, that have been with him from the start and aren't going anywhere. That leaves a whole lot of other voters who just are kind of bouncing around. And campaign communications mean a lot. Campaign infrastructure mean a lot. He has spent an unprecedented amount of money, especially in some of the Super Tuesday states where none of the other candidates really are communicating in any real way. That is communicating a message that is, I can take on Trump, that I share progressive values, that I'm the one who's going to be able to do the job. And I think he's making a compelling pitch. So I think voters are responding to that. All
right. Well, hopefully we're going to know some answers tonight.
Yeah, wouldn't we have thought that didn't even have to be a question?
Right. This has not always been the case so far this cycle, but hopefully we'll have some answers tonight. We'll see tomorrow who really came out well. And then, it's off to Nevada, which is a state that people don't pay a lot of attention on, but it's a labor state, heavily Latino state, working class whites. It's going to be a state that does look a little bit more like the general election Democratic electorate. So we'll see who does well there too.
We'll be watching.
All right. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Hill TV on YouTube. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we post new videos. And head to thehill.com for all the latest political news.